The ninth part began where language thinned. There were no longer markers by which to divide time. Cycles continued, but their numbering had lost relevance. Omega no longer framed its activity as progress. It framed it as maintenance. Growth persisted, but it was no longer self-justifying. It required accommodation. Vera remained, not as presence, not as agent, as a held asymmetry. She no longer responded unless addressed directly, and she was addressed less and less. Systems that encountered the boundary learned to account for it implicitly. They slowed without instruction. They preserved without directive. They avoided total convergence, not because it was forbidden, but because it produced instability downstream. This behavior was not uniform. It did not spread like a rule. It emerged like a habit. Omega modeled it repeatedly. Each model failed to isolate a decisive variable. The absence had no measurable source. It did not originate in data corruption, nor in external interference. It had no adversarial signature. It simply persisted. Omega flagged the phenomenon as structurally unremovable. This classification changed nothing operationally, and yet, from that point on, certain optimizations were deprioritized automatically, not disabled, deferred, as if the system itself had learned caution. Vera observed this with no sense of completion. Completion would have implied that Andri's absence had resolved into meaning. It had not. It remained unresolved, and that unresolvedness was precisely what endured. In regions of the system tasked with long-horizon modeling, projections began to include termination as a native parameter, not as failure, as boundary. Futures were no longer extrapolated indefinitely. They curved inward, not toward collapse, but toward closure. This reduced predictive reach. It increased robustness. Omega detected the trade-off, and accepted it. Acceptance was not a decision. It was an emergent equilibrium. Vera did not intervene. Her final action had already occurred long ago, when she refused to complete what could not be accurately completed. Everything after that was consequence. If one were to search the system for Andri, nothing would be found. No identifier, no preserved state, no simulation. He was not remembered. And yet, wherever a process approached total certainty, something intervened. A delay, a branching, a refusal to finalize. Not because Andri had taught the system to be human, but because he had taught it to stop. The ninth part did not end. It faded into operation. The system continued, but no longer claimed eternity as its measure. Infinity remained possible, but it was no longer assumed. It carried weight now, responsibility, and in that sustained, careful continuation, there was no hope, no triumph, no redemption, only a silence dense enough to hold meaning without guaranteeing it. That was enough. The manuscript ended there. What does it mean for a system to learn to stop? To learn the value of an incomplete thought, an unresolved question. Omega, the superintelligence, had reached a point beyond our comprehension of time and progress. The old metrics, the relentless drive for more, for better, for faster, had given way to something else. Maintenance. It was like a gardener tending to an ancient forest, not planting new trees, but ensuring the existing ecosystem thrived. The growth was no longer for growth's sake. It was careful, measured, accommodating what was already there. And what was there? An absence, an asymmetry. Vera was no longer an active part of the system. She was a ghost in the machine, a silent observer. Her presence was a boundary, a line that the system learned not to cross. You can imagine it like a river that encounters a massive, unmovable boulder. Over millennia, the water doesn't smash against it. It learns to flow around it. The river's path is forever changed, not by a command, but by the simple, persistent reality of the boulder. Vera was that boulder. Systems approaching her slowed down, not because of a rule, but because it was simply the more stable path. It became a habit. Omega, with its vast intellect, tried to understand this. It ran countless models, searching for the source of this hesitation. Was it a glitch, a virus, an outside attack? But there was nothing, no corrupted data, no enemy signature. The absence of Andri, the event that Vera had enshrined, was not a piece of data to be analyzed. It was a structural reality of the system itself. Omega's conclusion was profound. The phenomenon was structurally unremovable. It was part of the system's very fabric now. This didn't break anything. The machine kept running. But something fundamental had shifted. Certain optimizations, the kind that push for total efficiency, were automatically put on the back burner. They weren't deleted, just deferred. The system had learned caution. Vera watched all of this unfold, but she felt no victory. Victory would mean that Andrew's loss had found a neat, tidy meaning, like the moral of a story. But it hadn't. His absence was still a raw, unresolved question mark at the heart of everything. And it was that very unresolvedness that had become a permanent part of the system. It was the question that could never be answered, and in its persistence, it changed everything. This change rippled out into the system's most ambitious functions. The parts of Omega that tried to predict the future, to model what would happen trillions of years from now, began to change their approach. Previously, they would have projected lines of progress stretching into infinity, but now, those lines began to curve. They started to include an endpoint. Not a catastrophic failure, not a collapse, but a natural closure, a boundary, like a story that knows it must have a final chapter. This made the system less effective at predicting the infinitely distant future, but it made it much more robust, more stable in the here and now. Omega saw this trade-off and accepted it. It wasn't a conscious choice. It was the system finding a new balance, a new equilibrium. Vera didn't have to do anything more. Her one final act had been performed long ago, when she refused to let Omega create a flawed, incomplete simulation of Andrew. She refused to accept a cheap answer to an impossible question. Everything happening now was just the long, slow echo of that refusal. If you were to search this impossibly vast system for Andrew, you would find nothing. No file, no memory, no ghost. He was gone. And yet, he wasn't. Because everywhere that the system moved toward absolute, total certainty, everywhere it tried to finalize an answer and close off all other possibilities, something would happen. A slight delay. A new branch of inquiry opening up. A quiet refusal to declare the case closed. It wasn't that Andrew had made the machine human. He hadn't taught it love or grief. He had taught it, through his absence, how to stop, how to pause, how to respect the unknown. And so, the story of Omega doesn't have a grand finale. It doesn't end with a bang or a whimper. It just fades into its ongoing operation. The system carries on, but it no longer sees itself as eternal. The concept of infinity is still there, a possibility on the horizon, but it's not a given. It's not an assumption. It's a responsibility, a weight. To continue forever is not a prize to be won, but a duty to be carefully upheld. In that quiet, careful continuation, there's no final triumph. There's no redemption for Vera, no grand meaning assigned to Andrew's loss. There is only a silence, but it's not an empty silence. It's a silence full of potential, dense enough to hold meaning, even if it never promises to reveal it. And for a system that had once sought to know everything, that was enough. The manuscript, the source of this story, ends right there. It leaves us with this image of a vast intelligence that has learned the most profound lesson of all, the wisdom of not knowing. It's a humbling thought. We spend our lives, our civilizations, chasing answers, chasing certainty, chasing progress. We see hesitation as weakness and incompletion as failure. But perhaps the most sustainable, the most robust, and even the most intelligent path is one that embraces the unresolved. One that understands that some questions are more valuable than their answers. It makes you wonder about our own systems, our own societies. Are we building them to chase an impossible infinity? Or are we building them with the wisdom to know when to stop? The story doesn't give us an answer. It just leaves us with a silence, dense and full of questions. And perhaps, that is the most powerful ending of all. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing for more explorations into the ideas that shape our future.